talk a little bit about themselves as well. So I'm joined, I'll start here by Dr. Mark Roth. He's an associate professor of philosophy here at Drake. Professor Roth received his PhD in philosophy from the University of California, Davis, and he joined Drake's Philosophy and Religion Department in 2009. His work has appeared in several journals and anthologies, and he's the author of Philosophical Foundations of Neural Law. Next to him is Dr. Deborah Cronin. She's an assistant professor of psychology here at Drake. Professor Cronin earned her Bachelor's of Science from the University of Notre Dame and her MA and PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She runs the Attention and Cognition Lab here at Drake and teaches introductory psychology courses of sensation and perception and cognitive psychology courses, which many of you know because I think there's lots of psych students here. So, excellent. And then, of course, we are here because of the exhibition, 200% of Life, and Sean Downey, next to me, is the artist who created this exhibition. He's also a professor of art, and he received his BFA from the Kansas City Art Institute and his MFA from Boston University. He shows nationally and has had a number of solo exhibitions and has been included in many group exhibitions as well. He currently lives and works in Fairfield, Iowa, where he's an associate professor of art at the Maharishi International University, and made a long trek here today, but made it for our panel discussion. So what I'll do now is turn it over to our panelists to give you a little bit of intro about themselves and tell you kind of their areas of research interest, especially as it pertains to our topic here tonight of talking about virtual reality, augmented reality, and creativity.
Shall I begin? Okay. Well, thank you, Lila, and thanks for being here. I guess the weather is terrible. I appreciate it. So as Lila said, I've been here since 2009. Most of my research is in what you might call philosophy of cognitive science, which is a highly interdisciplinary field. A couple of years ago, I taught a Paths to Knowledge course for the honors program on the topic of creativity. And that was a very important class for me because it piqued my interest in sort of questions about the evolution of human creativity and what role or to what extent was sort of technological development relevant to that evolutionary process. A number of courses I teach invite students to think about the way in which culture broadly and technology and tools have an impact, potentially transformative impact on human cognition. To what extent are the abilities that we attribute to ourselves, and we sort of think of as belonging to us, and rightfully so. Really, to what extent is that, a result of just what you might think of as our naked brain? To what extent does that really have to do with the way in which brains operate in material cultures, and it might be more the interaction between the biological brain and sort of non-biological tools and props that is critical to understanding human cognition. I mean that very broadly, including things like creativity. And some of my own recent research is actually trying to explore those connections. So this is probably what's going on here is very exciting for me. So thank you for having me.
And yeah, thanks again to Lila, and thank you to all of you for coming, especially my students. It's good to see some familiar faces in here. I am interested in visual attention and visual perception and how we think about the things that we see, and how we decide where to look when we're presented with a visual environment. So things like, how do you find something that you're looking for? Or if you're presented with a scene, how do the expectations you have for the information present in that scene shape the way that you look at it? How does your prior knowledge and experiences shape the way that you explore the world with your eyes? And then I'm also interested in how eye movements kind of affect your ability to think and process the information in front of you. So I think looking at a lot of Sean's work, as I have the past couple of times I've been through this gallery, I'm really excited by some of the things that I see and how I see kind of vision science reflected in his art in so many ways. And in so many ways, I think artists and vision scientists have a lot of the same interests, and we study a lot of the same things, or we're interested in a lot of the same things for different reasons. So I'm also very excited to be here.
And I'm Sean. I made all this work. So yeah, for me, it's really exciting for me to be with these two because I feel like I'm kind of maybe experientially like experimenting on myself almost, you know, in terms of like making this work. There's this artist, Charlene von Heil, who talked about painters being these kind of freaks who just like stare at a wall for 8 hours a day, essentially. You're like 2 feet from the wall, just like making, you know, staring at a flat surface all day. And so weird things kind of happen, and that gives you a lot of time to kind of think about things and a lot of time to kind of hypothesize things. And the way that as an artist I deal with those hypotheses is I kind of like test them out in form, like I test them out in paintings, and in my case, and then also in sort of other types of work. And I've been really interested in, I think because looking is such a subject of painting, and it's been something that I've been thinking about since I was in my 20s, and I remember being a museum guard, and I was at the Nelson Atkins in Kansas City, and I would get stationed. At that time, they would station you in a room for 8 hours without a stool. And so I would just I'd have like 6 paintings or 6 random things to look at in that room for 8 hours. And so I spent a lot of time looking, just looking and thinking about looking and how looking changes over time and how you experience it. So for me, it, like when I encounter people who actually study that scientifically, I always have sort of all these questions about you know, into kind of analytically sort of getting a hold of that stuff. So yeah, so it's very exciting to me as well.
Yeah. That's also a museum guard, but we got to rotate, so that was helpful. So I wanted to start off, I've got some kind of like larger questions. I imagine that, you know, different kind of routes can be taken from them, but I wanted to start off with talking about how does technology change the way we interact with and understand our environment? So it's kind of a broad question, but I think we can kind of talk about some of the work.
Do you have a vision of who should speak first?
Well, I'm looking at Deb because she kind of helped me think about this question. And
Well, I'll look at Deb.
but, yeah, so let's look at her first, and then I'll let you guys
So I guess I should
jump in.
So I think, you know, in a lot of ways, technology makes us not look at our environment, and we spend a lot of time looking at screens and avoiding interacting with our environment. And one of the exciting things about augmented reality and virtual reality is we are kind of forced to interact with our environments again in a way that we can't when we're just kind of looking at our phones or looking at computer screens. And so when we have the ability to, you know, change our reality through augmented reality or explore a space in virtual reality, being able to explore that space actually changes how we're going to perceive that space in a way that, you know, looking at a static image or looking at something on your phone, you can't interact with it in the same way. And because you can't interact with it, you're not thinking about it in the same way that you would if you could.
I would say there are, you know, the very notion of what we think of as our environment is interesting to me. And, you know, I think for a lot of people, for years, you know, I would think the question of what is your local environment, that's just like whatever is sort of locally surrounding where your body and brain is. And right, that makes kind of sense. And for all of human history, basically that made sense. But one of the really interesting things I think that emerges from sort of study of neuroscience and cognitive psychology is the way in which our sense of things like presence, where we are, is not really just a direct function of where our physical bodies are located. It's rather more about what your brain figures out or infers based on the inputs it's getting. There are a number of different ways to try to kind of explore this or demonstrate this. I mean, some could include very simple experiments that you can perform They were sort of made famous by people like V.S. Ramachandran, that where if you can just get the right coordination of inputs, like tapping various kind of signals from your nose to your finger and stuff, you can induce in subjects rather quickly a sense that their body has changed shape. Like that, and one of the famous experiments is that you can induce in subjects the feeling as if their nose has grown 2 feet long. And you know, when you start to look at, say, what actually matters to our sense of where we are, so much of it really just has to do with the way in which, when our bodies, say, move, say, where those effects take place and what kind of feedback we're getting. So I like to get my students to take seriously that if you were hooked up digitally or via, say, radio waves or whatever, that if you have a thick enough bandwidth, and the fast enough signal and information, capacity, you could in effect receive stimulation and affect the world in a way that it would seem to you, say, you were in Boston, even if your body was sitting here in Des Moines. If you were getting the right inputs from things that were going on, say, downtown Boston, and they were having an impact on your brain, and your own sort of signals for acting were having effects in Boston that were in turn creating new inputs, that you could in effect transform, in principle, right? You could, as it were, feel as though you were 1,000 miles away. And so to you, if the question were, where do you think you are? You would probably answer, I'm in Boston, despite the fact that your body and brain were in Des Moines. And I think that idea, that for 2,000 years, 3,000, all of human history, that was never really a practical possibility, that kind of separation, I think is very interesting. So this notion of what our environment is, where we are, is much more fluid, and I think subject to negotiation in a way that I think a lot of Sean's work kind of explores that in fascinating ways to me.
Yeah, I think from, just speaking experientially, because all this work that's in the show was made, that has some connection to virtual reality. All of these things are paintings and images of virtual environments that I've built. They're like direct paintings. They're not collaged images. They're sort of unified, like direct observational paintings of these virtual spaces. And I remember the first time going into VR, working with these photogrammetry models of like everyday objects, and having this feeling of the kind of hallucinatory like thinness of everything in virtual reality, and coming back out and feeling like this residual hallucinatory thinness about the world out here, like the things kind of melded a little bit. But one thing I'm really interested in is like with screens. So because I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between digital and analog, like painting is like the oldest thing, like cave painting is just like colored mud smudged on a surface essentially. Bouncing back and forth between these two worlds, I have this feeling about like when I'm looking at a screen, I have an anticipation. I think a lot about time, and I think about this, you have this anticipation of change when I'm looking at a screen, like that it's pixels and they could just rearrange and be something else in the next minute, or they're always shifting. And when I look at a painting, it doesn't change, or it pretends not to change, I would say. Because one thing I've realized is that if you look at a painting for long enough, it actually does change. It pretends to reveal itself to you all at once, but a good painting actually kind of unfolds over time. And that's you kind of creating that movement in your head and in your psychology and in the space, kind of moving around the painting and looking at it in different ways. And so I'm really interested in that idea of place kind of moving back and forth, and that idea of, like what Martin and Kevin were both talking about, this idea of how a representational or recognizable image can create a sense of another space that's not here right now, and so you can kind of project into that space, but then the paint itself kind of grounds itself aggressively in this space here with you as an object, and that kind of tension back and forth between like here and not here. And I feel like virtual reality right now is like at the level of like AOL and like Ask Jeeves. I just saw this like email from HTC Vive yesterday that was like about the Viveverse, and it was the dumbest thing I've ever seen, like what they were suggesting that you would do. But I know that it will eventually, especially when haptic things start to get involved and like a sense of touch, that it will eventually get to a point where it will feel more seamless. And I think for me, augmented reality is so much more interesting than virtual reality because of that, the butting up against each other. Because I'm interested visually also in like languages, visual languages that hit up against each other, like vernacular languages of like cartoons or comics, like hitting up against sort of quote unquote like realistic or photographic images. And augmented reality, I mean, that's becoming so everyday to us, that kind of juxtaposition. It doesn't seem novel or sort of surprising anymore. And that's another thing I'd be curious to hear more from like the scientific angle and the philosophical angle about how things that initially feel novel sort of shift and become immediately kind of metabolized, and they lose their novelty very fast. Even like face filters. Like I remember, like the first time you saw a face filter, you're like, oh, this is amazing. And then now it's just like, oh, okay, whatever.
Well, we can kind of, like elaborate on that, and that's actually sort of what one of my next kind of first thoughts or questions was about the idea of like simulation of life through art is not like a new idea through virtual or augmented reality. I mean, as you said, like painting is like this simulation of life, and then you have more realistic versions, the advent of photography, and then you have film, and as you said, it becomes something very spectacular at first, and now we're very kind of familiar and acquainted with that space. So I guess my question is, is that, we could talk about maybe how the same virtual or augmented reality is, or is it different? Like, is it truly kind of more separate from those things, or is it just that sensation of us feeling like, wow, we've never seen this before, maybe kind of elaborating on this idea you're talking about of that, familiarity of, our sense of what is real and not real.
Yeah, I think, I'm sort of irresponsibly talking about this because I don't really know all of the terminology, but the stuff around motion perception and the idea of like still things, our brains sort of filling in movement. To me, that's one thing, but then when it gets, and that's something that actually like painting, like the static imagery of painting kind of plays around with and has historically played around with, like knowing how your eye moves around, even intuitively knowing how the eye moves around, and then kind of playing on that so that certain kinds of, you feel implied movements, you almost feel an experiential movement looking at a painting depending on how it's sort of pulling your attention around. But then in virtual reality or augmented reality, it having to do with what's stationary and what's moving. Like in virtual reality, like if the file's too big and my headset starts to crash and the world starts to move when I turn my head, it like ruins it. It makes you feel like you're gonna kind of fall over. It's the most kind of topsy-turvy experience, and so it's relying on me, like my perception of being static, having some kind of thing that hits up against, like movement. So I'd be curious to hear more about that in terms of like how because when you study attention, is someone just seated?
Usually, yeah, and they're not just seated. We have them in like a little chin rest so they can't even move their head.
Right.
But no, I mean, some people have, like, virtual reality is like a whole new world for us. So we can actually monitor people's eye movements as they're moving through virtual spaces and interacting with things virtually. And as you said, like, sometimes things go wrong and then we make them sick and they never want to come back. Yeah, I think it's really, I think the weird thing about virtual reality is, we are visual creatures at base. Like the sense that is most represented in our brain is vision, and so we rely on our visual experience to tell us where we are and what we're doing and what position our body's in. And you can manipulate that in virtual reality by, creating this new space where you're suddenly seeing something while you're sitting in your couch in your apartment, and it's totally different than where you actually are. And then, like, if you have that experience of like, vision is moving, but I'm not moving, then that is like, you're clashing your visual experience with all of your other senses saying, no, I'm staying still. And that can be extremely disorienting. But in terms of like how vision is moving through information, I thought that was really interesting, and kind of to tie back to what you were talking about earlier with like sort of creating things that are like familiar and also breaking that. One of the things that I noticed, especially about these two paintings, where it's very obviously like a desk scene, it's an office scene, and like you look at it and you're like, oh, it's an office, and so when you have that feeling, that starts to create expectations about what you're going to see in an office, and those expectations might include like an office chair, which is there, a filing cabinet, which is there, some folders and notebooks, which is there, but then there's all of this other stuff that like you're kind of like, once you get to those places, you're like, wait a second, like, is this an office? What is happening in these little scenes? So it's kind of drawing you in and pulling you around and breaking the expectations that you had when you initially looked at it. And I think a lot of your paintings do that. You kind of set the global scene, which creates all these expectations, and then as you look closer and closer, it kind of breaks them in different ways. It's really interesting. I don't know if that's a little tangential, but.
No, that's good. I think.
No, I'm struck by, and I really, this is where I'm going to be like, hey, Dad, come on, can you like fill in all the details, right? And correct me when I'm wrong. Because I'm just really just like, okay, I don't remember this stuff. But I'm struck by how much, when we think of a particular like sensory modality, so if you're even thinking about like visual development, you might think, okay, it's just what the eyes are doing. But I want to say I'm remembering this very famous experiment involving cats, like developing, where whether or not, when you think about your visual development from a young age, right? Like you don't just see in 3D the way you do like as an adult. Like there's a lot of developments that take place early on. And if I'm remembering correctly, there were these studies that showed that like in cats, whether the cat would develop sort of normal cat vision had to do with whether or not it was able to walk around. Like if it wasn't able to walk around, it wouldn't develop what you think was normal cat vision. So it was like the development of like vision, right, seemed to be heavily dependent on the connection between what you were getting in visually for the eyes, but also what your body was doing. And I think so much of our experience of the world is having to do with this, the way in which input from a number of different sensory modalities, so it's like, we talk about haptic, but just all these things that it gets your sort of brain is like taking this all and saying, okay, this is what's going on. And then when you start then kind of teasing those apart the way you can with technology, you can kind of get the visual inputs without the motor inputs. It kind of throws the brain for a curveball, right? And it can have this very interesting sort of effect, like phenomenologically. It can feel weird. And I think that's kind of a lot of what you're saying. I'm hearing that, right? And now a lot of what you're doing with your work is sort of playing with that disconnect that you can sometimes induce.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is really cool. By the way, watching these things, look at these paintings.
Yeah, definitely. That I think, and one thing I think about in terms of that is like when you overload the senses and then when you limit the senses, like that kind of, what's that kind of hallucination called? That's like the prisoner's cinema. Like when you limit sort of sensory input, the brain keeps kind of creating it. And I'm very curious about that in terms of like one thing I think about in terms of painting, especially having been a museum guard, like I mentioned before, is like the idea of boredom and the way that boredom, like what happens when you look at the same thing for a long time and then you get bored and then you move past what's like the next thing that comes after boredom. And it's this thing, that to me is like the most exciting space. Like I remember looking at a painting for like 3 hours once, and I went through like every emotional state, and after I went through boredom, I got to like this state of like almost like idleness, which is like Kierkegaard like says like idleness is like the opposite of boredom almost, even though they seem similar. And it gets to this space where things actually start to open up, and the thing that is like the most kind of quotidian, kind of boring object becomes really miraculous. And that's to me like the main reason like why I would want to make a painting. And all of the ways that I'm trying to use technology is to try to get to that point where the thing that we overlook or so much of our life is about like name something so that you can kind of move on from it. I keep staring at this like ugly pedestal because I'm like, if I look at this for a while, I'm like, that's a pretty interesting object here. But it's like that idea of any piece of the world, any piece of reality is this like opportunity for this extremely strange, mysterious experience. But most of what we do is in order to kind of get to the next thing, we kind of say, okay, chair it so I can move on. So we orient ourselves really fast. And so Dave Hickey, this art critic, said like that everything else in our life is like there to kind of orient us, and maybe art could be like the thing that like disorients us, like willfully disorients us. And I think of it as a space to do that because it kind of can hopefully residually like carry over when you like leave the viewing experience,
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and as you were describing the experience of staring at a visual object for a long time, it was reminding me of the experience that I think everyone has of like, you hear a word too often and all of a sudden something super mundane like nurse, you're like, nurse, years, nurse, what does that even mean? Why is it spelled the way it is? Where did that come from? And I think that's really interesting that, I mean, I haven't fortunately had to stare at something for 3 hours before, but it's really interesting that that kind of, the auditory experience that I think we've all had really extends to the visual and can kind of break down in the same way, where you get past the familiarity of it and start really investigating the details heavily.
Yeah, and then the other thing about like these things in this world and of everything in this gallery is like almost entirely built from like the most like mundane stuff that I pass by every day. Like I sort of make photogrammetry models and then bring them into VR and start playing around with them, and they become like scalable and strange. And so that actually changes the way, if you produce for yourself an encounter like that with your everyday world, then it changes the way you encounter that world, even when you're not like in the midst of whatever you're doing.
Well, I know, I don't know where we're going with this, but this is just horrific. But I do notice this. I do this with stop signs sometimes, like stoplights, where I'm driving and I'm monitoring things that are around me, but I'm seeing everything really as mostly like as a sign to what I should do next, right? As a cue, right? This is happening, so then do that. Instead of just sort of confronting it on its own terms and being like, there's a red light, and look at the damn thing, right? It's actually kind of beautiful, but I'm always looking past it, right? I'm just sort of seeing it. I'm sort of taking it for some little bit of information or some sign, right? It is a sign of something that's relevant to some goal I have. But and whatever else is going on there, right? I just sort of ignore, right? And then there's these moments though where you're just like, let's really look at that thing. And all of a sudden when you do, it starts to look unfamiliar and it's kind of confusing. And like you were saying, even the idea of being in the virtual world, it sort of prepares you for thinking, this is kind of weird. But then when you leave it, it almost like it allows you to sort of see everyday life in a way that makes it seem weird too. It's almost like practice for seeing things weirdly. Or weirdly is not the right word, but I think you kind of get what I'm saying. It's a kind of preparation to maybe when you leave the gallery, you start to have that kind of encounter with sort of the ordinary familiar objects that don't look like art, but really are going to induce maybe that same kind of reaction.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of that, I like working with students too, especially at the university level, because I feel like, and again, I'm sure you would both know way more about this, but like the way that formative experiences like shape the way that you perceive, and then that kind of the things that you do on a daily basis actually like literally change the way that you look at the world. So and you can sort of, I like to kind of do these experiments with myself. Like, what if I read poetry every night for 45 minutes? Do I experience the world a different way than if I like watch TV every night? And not that one is better or worse than the other, but like, do they produce a different, like a residual different experience? And like, it's weird that I keep thinking of this story that I apologize, it's like maybe slightly morbid. But when I was at Boston University, an art student, this was still a thing, people would do this, they would this used to be like a thing that people would do in addition to drawing the model, they would draw cadavers. And I had this opportunity, I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll do that. I guess that's the thing people do. And so I went to the BU Medical School one morning, and I was like up there drawing cadavers for like with a few other people in the room. And one thing about drawing is like you very quickly like dissociate from what it is you're looking at, from the content, and you're just like, oh no, that's wrong, no, I need to do that shape. And so I got into that zone for a long time where I was just thinking about looking and transcribing and drawing. And then I like had to go out for lunch, and I walked downstairs. I got in the elevator, there was nobody in there, and I walked outside, and there were people walking around on the campus, and it like blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, they're moving, like the people, like, and then suddenly for like a split second, I could see that there was like the material of us, and then there was something like moving us around, because I'd experienced like experientially like that, not, you know,
Yeah.
like these forms that didn't have that animating force in them. And that like put this very strange, I mean, it was a very weird formative experience that I had when I was a student. And a similar kind of experience was like the first time in VR, like when I was in there for a while working with all these like models of objects that were in the room that I was in. So when I was like scaling them up and turning them around, there was no gravity, and it was, you know, I could sort of play with them and take them apart. And then I took the helmet off, and there were those things there. And like I was saying earlier, I could feel this sort of strangeness, and I could also feel how suddenly how easily our senses are fooled. Like you were saying, like I could be easily convinced that I was in Boston, and that implies like when there's no way to there's an analytical way to write about it. Yes, indeed, yes, it does that. But like experientially, when you have that feeling, it seems like it implies something else about reality that is like very hard to get at. This kind of invisible thing that's happening underneath that is much broader than our senses. It's just like for a second you have a glimpse of like how limited our senses are. And the first time I met you, we were talking about that. And I mean, so I think about how technology might potentially give you those kinds of glimpses as a tool, you know, almost like a prosthetic or something.
Well, and I feel like the work in this exhibition is almost like so much of it to me, after kind of getting to know you and hearing you talk about it, seems like this study or like study of perception, or like that the subject itself like becomes not just like the things that are here, but it's about how you're in it or interacting with it, or how it feels familiar or unfamiliar. And yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, the way one's like, whether it's your eye moving around the painting, or whether it's just like your feeling of moving around the painting, and you have these different, I guess like, to me it's interesting that you have things like magic lanterns and stereoscopes like as subjects in these, because it's this sort of play on like ways that humans have kind of tried to mess with our own like sense of perception. Yeah, so I think any of you could talk about this, but just like the idea of how like perception itself is both kind of a method and subject at the same time.
Yeah, and then, I mean, I've talked about that already a bit, I think, but I'd be curious, like building on that. So you study this all day, you're doing all these experiments, does it affect your own perception of the world? You know? Like, do you suddenly start walking around, like if you become a psychology major, like are you going to look at the world in a certain way? I mean, you are, right? You know?
Oh yeah, I mean, so like as a vision scientist, like my first bunch of studies that I did were visual search studies. So you're looking for some object in a bunch of other objects, and then you learn about all of the features that help you find the things that you're looking for. So now when I go to the grocery store, I'm like, okay, what does this object look like? And I will like Google something that I haven't bought before so I can see it, and then I'm like, okay, now I can find it. So it's not, so that's like, it just sort of like totally changes like my approach to visual things, and then I'm constantly like, I'll notice weird things about my vision where I'm like, oh, that's something that I know about and probably no one else cares about. Or like, I think one of the things that maybe my intro students will recognize is one of like, we aren't super aware of the fact that we don't see very well out here, right? We see
I was going to ask you about this, just to
We
talk
see-
about that,
we
because it's
see
so
this.
so fascinating, right?
Yeah, like all of the information that you have, almost all of it is from this little window right in front of wherever you're looking, and everything else is just blurry and filled in with whatever, information your brain can guess is over there.
Yeah, so can I just interject and say,
Yeah.
ask you, and I know that maybe there's like a number of different competing theories or whatever, or maybe it's all been settled. But so on the one hand, when students learn about this, they of course want to know, then why doesn't it seem that way? Right? I mean, because it doesn't, you're like, oh, you're getting all this in detail information right in front, and everything else is all low information, it's blurry, and you're like, but it sort of seems all filled out, all the way to the edge, right?
Yeah.
So, Gabby, could you just maybe speak a little bit to why is that?
Yeah, totally. So what I was gonna say is, as a vision scientist, I'm very aware of that fall off. So that has totally changed my perception, just understanding that. So why do we have this perception of it being so rich out here when the reality is the richest part is right here? We are constantly collecting information as we move our eyes around, and our brain remembers a lot of that information. It can kind of fill in the gaps. So you've got like pieces out in the periphery, and your brain, to give you a kind of coherent experience of the world, will take its knowledge about what situation you're in and just kind of gloss things over enough so that your perception is that all of that stuff is still there. So it's very much your brain is really a prediction machine, and so it's predicting based off of limited inputs and your prior knowledge what is out here, and then you believe it.
That reminds me so much of, there's this writer who talks about this idea that the imagination is actually not very good. It's like pretty 2D. It doesn't produce realistic images very well. And that she's sort of talking about really great writers. What they actually do is the structure of the writing almost provides like an instruction manual that you read, like almost like running code. And it reproduces sequentially through time a series of things that produce a more realistic image than we normally come up with. And she sort of has these examples of Proust sort of creating these images of like a bookshelf with this light coming in, and she talks about the structure really specifically. So it's not just that like, oh, he poetically came up with the right adjectives. It has to do with the sequence of how things are unfolding as you read them that slowly produces a stronger and stronger image, and then so a very limited amount of information kind of fills in, or is able to be filled in with all of the kind of external. And that's something, like drawing and painting, it's like been concerned with that forever, like how certain visual cues will very quickly orient you and allow you to fill in all of the stuff that's kind of not there, the kind of implied things.
I think I'm glad you brought that up, and I think there is some connection between this, or let's say, I don't know, an association in my head. And I think this was one of the questions that Lila was wanting to ask about. It occurred to me that as I was sort of thinking about what we're going to be doing today, I was reminded of a number of experiments that sort of really reveal, I think, how critically important what you might think of as the externalization of a thought or an image is to creative processes. So I'm going to take a very, very mundane-ish kind of example. So probably most of you, and philosophers always roll their eyes when they hear this because they were like, oh, you can use that example for what point now? The 150th point you might make with this. But you may be familiar with those images, like those duck-rabbit images, where you see a picture and you can see it at once as an image of a rabbit, like the rabbit's ears, and then you can kind of sort of flip your perspective on your interpretation and see it as a duck. This is, hopefully most of you sort of are familiar with this. So what we're able to do is we have this signal, this stable image, and we can see it as a duck, and then we can see it as a rabbit, and we can't sort of see it at both, and the change is pretty dramatic, right? It's recognizable. Well, apparently when you ask subjects to sort of visualize the rabbit, say, and then see it as the duck, they have a really hard time doing it. But when you have it out in front as an object of perception, they can go back and forth a lot easier. Now, if you're thinking about that in terms of the ability for a single image to say, sort of to sort of give multiple interpretations or meanings to a single thing, like the way that that's so critical to a lot of successful art, painting, writing, I mean, whatever. This idea that, we just sort of have everything in our head, and then the written or the written word or the painting is just a mere externalization of something that's all just inside. It's kind of, it sort of gives, I think, some reason for thinking that that's a bad picture, that so much of our ability to engage with and sort of creatively explore the world really does require us to externalize sort of ideas and then use them as new inputs that then that process can unfold over time. I mean, another kind of example of this, right, is the way in which, I try to get my students to think, imagine what it would be like in terms of what you think you can do, what your abilities are for doing academic work. If you couldn't use pen, paper, typewriter, just, write a book, write a 20-page essay in your head. They all I couldn't do it. I couldn't get much beyond a Jack and Jill story. And that's just true. I say the same here, right? So do you take that away from us? And we're we're SOL. And what's going on? We have ideas, we write them down. Now they're externalized. We revisit them and think about what we wrote, and then we add notes. And there's this iterative process, right? And then all of a sudden you get the finished product over many iterations, and it's and you think, wow, look what I did. And yeah, you did, but think about how much of this really required you to externalize, re-perceive, reinterpret, externalize again. It's just kind of that process, this unfolding, is really what generates that product. And I think that's just so fascinating and really not sufficiently appreciated.
Yeah, I think about that in painting, but I also think about the kind of sublime experiences I've had reading philosophy have to do with something that's almost like an incredibly complicated experience that's being crafted in words, and it has to unfold in a certain way. I remember when I first started reading certain philosophical texts, I'd be like, oh, why is it it seems overly complicated? That doesn't need to be. And then but if you slow down and let it unfold at its pace, it's doing that, hopefully, usually, for a reason, and that it's creating this kind of experience of an incredibly difficult to articulate aspect of reality. It's like trying to kind of grab at something that doesn't want to be grabbed at. And I think, for sure, painting, and I'm always very interested in art that is sort of trying to do multiple things at the same time, and trying, I would say, that idea of the rabbit and the old woman or whatever is that's pretty much the whole thing I'm trying to do. It's the experience of the image and the object and the references and all that sort of stuff at the same time. Because there are certain moments when I feel I can see, I do this with drawing students where you're can you see the positive space and the negative space? You can see the two faces looking at each other, or you can see the goblet and you can feel that muscle flex in your brain. And there is a way that you can sort of see both at the same time, this kind of field independence thing or something there. And it's that experience of that in-between space, I don't know, somehow feels it's in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It's this means something, this is important, it feels important.
So I think, our brains really don't like ambiguity, and so all of the duck rabbit and the old woman, young woman, and the Becker cubes and all of that they're ambiguous objects, and our perception switches from one interpretation to the other interpretation. And just the way that our brain works is, we want an answer. We want to know what this object is. We don't want ambiguity. And so that space that you're talking about is getting stuck in that ambiguity. Your brain wants an answer and it's not getting it. And so you're finding that space that you never really have most of the time when you're dealing with non-ambiguous objects, which is most of the things that we encounter in a daily life. So I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about getting stuck in that weird space that's so rare.
Yeah.
Being kind of mindful of time, I wanted to sort of pose this sort of last question, which is when I was initially thinking about this panel and who I thought could speak on it and what fields I wanted to be involved in. I guess it seems sort of simple. I also think it's kind of complicated, but, I mean, it's definitely complicated, but how, I want to just talk about for a few minutes how creativity can be enabled by things like virtual reality, but also stunted by it. Because I feel like my initial reaction when I thought about that question was like, well, it's going to stunt creativity, and that was kind of like my gut feeling was like, no, this is bad for things like art. And then I think the more that I thought about your paintings and the way you're using it as this kind of interesting means to jump between familiar and the unfamiliar and kind of help people think about how they're looking and what does it mean to look at something and perceive it, that maybe that is actually sort of a more fruitful space than I was giving it credit for. But I kind of kept coming back to this idea of, you know, but you made the painting. Like the paintings are the thing that kind of get you to that space. So, you know, I don't know. I want to hear your thoughts on I guess, you know, how it can be, you know, helpful in that creative process, and then also how it can be maybe something that slows it down or stunts it.
Well, I'd say just like to get the conversation started, I mean, one thing, I think it's not a good idea it's never panned out very well to say that like a new technology is going to ruin everything. It's just because it never does. It actually so isn't. Like would be, you know, like electronic music, that's going to ruin everything. You know, like photography is going to ruin everything.
Like photography would be the dumb.
VR kills the artist, right? It's
Right.
like, oh, calm down.
So like, of course, it's like, oh, okay, well. You know,
But I will say that like the thing that I think I'm really interested in is like the irresponsible use of technology and the kind of like undermining of technology and trying to turn it on, like always immediately thinking about how to turn it on itself and make things that that weren't like planned out for you to do happen, you know? And so I remember when like compressed video, digital video started like you know, AVI files and things like that started becoming more the way that video was shared, and then like immediately, you know, artists and other creative people or whatever start noticing like all these glitches when things are loading and how they don't load, and then they start saying like, well, how can I make that happen? And then like data moshing and this kind of like undermining of the technology starts to happen, and that's where I think like when I think about like Photoshop or these certain applications, there are a bunch of people, there is a committee who's like deciding what they think that I would want to do, like a user on the other end would want to do with this application. And so I'm always thinking about like how to think through their lens and then like make it do what I want to do, you know, which is where I think sometimes it can be okay to like not, you know, to sort of be like a bull in a china shop in like a field that you don't really belong in, you know, to just sort of like download some software and just start teaching yourself how to use it and like messing up and making mistakes, because rather than like, oh, I'm going to take a course that will teach me step by step, you know, with all these models, and I mean that can be very useful as well, but I find that you learn the most through like, or at least I learned the most like heuristically, like just through like trial and error, trial and error, trial and error, and so I mean I'd be curious like in terms of Martin, you're studying like creativity, like how that relates to this idea of creativity, because honestly like I feel like people think like the artist would know about creativity, but I'm always like, what does that word mean? I don't really, what does that mean, like creativity? I don't know what that means exactly. Does that mean like it's something new, or what does it mean? You know?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, I do kind of, but I mean, I'm listening to you and I'm just like trying to like think about the question, and you know, I'm trying to connect it to some of the things that we've been talking about. And one of the things I come back to a lot is the danger of, and I guess this is why when you're thinking about like the important, I feel like I'm I always feel like I'm like sounding like a Marxist or something when I say these things. Like the important social function of your art, right? I mean, like of art of this kind, you know, I think it was like Dostoevsky once said, you know, something like, okay, this is the 19th century, right? Man gets used to everything, the beast, right? That's like, gets used to everything and then it's the beast, right? That this is like really a kind of a horrible thing about us in some ways, or it can be. And I think that what, you know, I always worry about, and I think we all sort of maybe have glimpses of this, but we don't maybe see it for what it is enough. In this sense of like where it starts to become weird, like it becomes like nurse. When, you know, a technology develops that is, you know, it catches fire and everyone starts to use it and it's great and you can count the 50,000 ways in which it like makes things easier, but then you kind of get used to it as you know, the primary mode, say for communication, say. And then because it becomes familiar, it's sort of harder for you to be able to look at it like in this sort of detached way and be like, what are we doing? I mean, the other day I remember somebody wrote something like on Facebook, and I hadn't used Facebook for like a decade, but I was using it and I remember my reaction was, gee, I don't know what emoji to use to reduce my complex reaction to what you've said, right? I don't know how to reduce that complex feeling I'm having to an emoji. And I said this in jest, right? But I mean, I think the point was well taken, which is that it's sort of like sometimes we don't look across this and we're sort of like, I'll just give it a thumbs up, or it's sort of like, what are we doing, right? I mean, and sometimes, right, it's like, if it's like, oh, and we don't like ambiguity, but, you know, we just don't like to be uncomfortable, and so we might think, well, here's a really terrible way to respond to that. Just make sure everything you ever generate is the kind of thing for which you just really nothing more than a single emoji is actually would be appropriate, right? Be vapid or whatever, and it's like, okay, we can all just play along, and it's like, and this idea that we just kind of get used to it so fast. And it can be technology, so in a way, it's like, the idea, like this is my favorite painting. And I can go into why, but if you haven't had a chance to look around, I would invite you to look at this. I love this painting, this one, for so many reasons. In part because it really, at one time, it seems like the arm belongs to like the space where the hat is. But it's coming out of something that seems also very much in the distance. It's like, where does it belong? And I just love this so much. It's just like a really great encapsulation. But this idea of like getting you to be like, wait, what? Wait, what's happening here, right? That kind of wake-up call. To me, I mean, so maybe this is related to the creativity thing, is that the creativity sort of dials down the more you just become complacent with whatever it is that you have, right? I mean, it can be beautiful stuff, it can be great stuff, but if it just sort of becomes seemingly just so too familiar, right? It loses all its sort of significance. It gets gutted of all that stuff, and it just becomes kind of empty. And
Yeah, I think. I mean, in listening to you, the other thing I think about is like that. It's not like technology that stunts creativity. It's like people. It's like other people. Like, and so I think about like social media. Like one thing I think about is like people in their formative years. I'm thinking about young art students, like making work with already the imagined endpoint of it being out in front of an audience of people, and like working through a kind of expectation, like reverse engineering what they're doing toward a kind of like fantasized like outcome for this thing, is how it will exist out in the world, and if it will be kind of like, if it will get the reaction that you want. And I think that's where I feel like it's really important to like create this kind of bubble for yourself within like technological spaces that's completely kind of free and open, and it doesn't, or just to like not care at all. That's another way. I mean, there are people that do that, and that's great. I mean, if you're that kind of person, then you can do that, and you can just sort of like, because there's a way that that a lot of technology that we have now, I think, is very much focused on the product, the end product. And like when I was in art school, it was like there was like this mantra that they drilled into us that was like process over product, and it was always that like the outcome of the product or the thing you made should be a symptom of a process, and that the process was the thing that you would focus on, because that's the only way you could possibly be surprised by the outcome, because otherwise you would sort of have an outcome in mind and then you would reverse engineer it, and that outcome would always be only as good as you were at that moment. But the only way you could kind of evolve yourself and push yourself forward was to have this kind of open-ended process. And I think that that's like obviously like really related to both like science and philosophy, because it's this kind of process of experimentation and asking questions and then seeing where they lead without an idea, hopefully, of where it's going to lead necessarily, or the willingness to be surprised.
How did you reach it?
Yeah, sure. No. Yeah, so I mean, I kind of want to circle back a little bit to what you said at first, which was like with Photoshop, there's a team of engineers creating rules and kind of constraining how you can use the program in a way. And I think that's a space where VR really allows us to kind of break free in many ways of the rules that we're all used to and that we've kind of become accustomed to. So like you said, that you can, like there's no gravity and you can stretch and shrink, and that sort of gives you the opportunity to like experience the world in a totally different way without some of the boundaries that we normally have in like real life. And then breaking those boundaries, you're sort of opening the possibilities of like, you're almost allowing yourself to explore the possibilities because those boundaries aren't there anymore. Whereas when we're going through our daily lives, we don't even think about the boundaries, and so we're stuck in our little boxes without realizing the boxes are there. So I think that kind of, yeah, you're literally getting yourself out of the box. By getting into the box.
Thank you. That's kind of my last question here. I think that I think you should all hopefully take some time to look at the exhibition. We'll hang out here, and you can come up and ask questions of us. But the gallery's open till 8, and I definitely encourage you to look at Sean's artwork. There's the oil paintings and ceramics, but there's also a couple of augmented reality pieces that are on the pedestals. But thank you all so much for coming today.
Thank you.